In the early 19th century, a letter could travel hundreds of miles, pass through several horse stations, and finally arrive at your front door. But there was a problem. The sender often paid nothing. The recipient had to cover the full cost of delivery. And if they could not afford it, the letter was taken away without ever being opened. Imagine a postal worker standing outside your home, holding news from a son at war, a husband working in a distant city, or a relative who had left home years earlier. The letter was only a few steps away, but the words inside remained out of reach. That was how the postal system once worked: slow, expensive, and largely available only to those who could afford it. The world did not need more horses. It did not need more postal workers. It needed a simple way to prove that delivery had already been paid for. The solution was not a giant machine or a complicated invention. It was a tiny piece of paper with adhesive on the back, placed in the corner of an envelope. That small piece of paper would transform commerce, romance, warfare, and the way people connected across distance. We call it the postage stamp. But to understand why this tiny object mattered, we have to understand the world before it existed. Long before the postage stamp, humans had already built systems for carrying messages across great distances. Kings sent orders through mounted couriers. Armies relied on messengers to move information between battlefields. Empires created relay stations where exhausted horses could be replaced and official letters could continue their journey. But these systems were not built for ordinary people. They were built to move commands, taxes, military intelligence, and official decisions. Communication was a tool of administration before it became a service for the public. For most of history, long-distance communication belonged to rulers, soldiers, wealthy merchants, and government officials. A farmer could not easily send news to a child living hundreds of miles away. A worker could not simply write home whenever they wished. A private letter was often expensive, slow, and uncertain. Some people even developed secret marks on the outside of envelopes, allowing families to exchange simple messages without paying to open the letter. The world already knew how to move information. What it had not yet discovered was how to make that system simple, affordable, and available to everyone. By the early 19th century, the postal network was growing, but it was still a system designed around distance, complexity, and privilege. That was about to change. By the 1830s, Britain's postal system had become large, expensive, and painfully complicated. Then Rowland Hill, a school teacher and social reformer with no army of couriers and no postal empire of his own, asked a question that challenged the entire system. Why should the price of a letter depend so heavily on distance? Hill argued that much of the real cost came not from carrying the letter, but from calculating fees, recording routes, and collecting payment from the recipient. His solution was radical because it was so simple. The sender would pay in advance. The price would be based mainly on weight, not distance. And every prepaid letter would carry a small mark, proving that the fee had already been paid. That mark would eventually become the postage stamp. To officials inside the existing system, the proposal sounded reckless. Lower prices could destroy revenue. Prepaid postage could invite fraud. And if millions of ordinary people suddenly began writing letters, the network might collapse under the volume. But Hill believed the opposite. Lower prices would not shrink the system. They would expand it. More families would write, more businesses would communicate, and the postal service would grow by becoming accessible. He was not merely proposing a cheaper way to send mail. He was proposing a new idea of communication, one in which distance no longer determined who had the right to be heard. And in 1840, that idea was about to become a small black square. On May 6, 1840, Britain introduced something the world had never seen before. It was small, black, and printed with the profile of a young Queen Victoria. Its price was 1 penny. Its name was the penny black. It had no perforated edges. Each stamp had to be cut from a printed sheet by hand. In its corners were letters identifying its position on that sheet. The stamp itself was simple. It had no country name, no elaborate message, and no obvious sign that it would change history. But the idea behind it was revolutionary. The penny black turned Hill's reform into something ordinary people could see, buy, and place on a letter. It removed the awkward moment when a recipient had to decide whether a letter was worth the cost of opening. It made postal charges easier to understand, and most importantly, it opened the system to millions of people who had previously been priced out. Families could write more often. Businesses could move orders and contracts faster. News, apologies, and declarations of love could enter the same system. The penny black did not remain in use for long in its original form, but that hardly mattered. The stamp had already introduced a new principle. Communication should not belong only to the wealthy and powerful. A tiny square of paper had turned the postal system from a privilege into a public service, and once the world understood what that made possible, the idea could no longer be contained within Britain. The penny black may have been born in Britain, but the idea behind it was too useful to remain there. Other countries quickly saw what prepaid postage could do. Within a few years, postal stamps appeared beyond Britain. Brazil issued its bullseye stamps in 1843, and the United States followed with federal postage stamps in 1847. A simple stamp reduced confusion, made prices easier to understand, and allowed more people to send letters. One by one, postal systems began adopting the same principle. Soon, every nation wanted its own stamp. Each new design carried more than a postal value. It carried a name, a ruler, a national symbol, or an image of the country that issued it. But as stamps crossed borders, a new problem appeared. International mail was complicated. A single letter might pass through several countries, each with its own prices, routes, and rules. Governments had to decide who would carry it, who would be paid, and how responsibility would be shared. The solution was not a better stamp, it was a shared set of rules. Bilateral agreements came first, but the growing volume of international mail eventually demanded a permanent system of cooperation. In 1874, representatives from 22 countries signed the Treaty of Berne. The agreement did something extraordinary. It began turning dozens of separate postal systems into what was effectively a single postal territory. A letter could now cross national borders under shared rules, instead of being trapped in a maze of prices, agreements, and competing authorities. For the first time, the world was beginning to behave as though distance belonged to one connected system. A tiny piece of paper was no longer just attached to an envelope. The stamp had begun as proof that one person had paid for one letter. It had become a passport into a global communication network. At first, a postage stamp had one simple purpose: to prove that a letter had been paid for. But governments soon realized that the small space in the corner of an envelope could carry something more powerful than a price. It could carry an identity. Stamps began to feature kings, presidents, national heroes, monuments, landscapes, and symbols of progress. Every design answered the same question: what does this country want the world to see? Unlike a monument fixed in one city, a stamp could carry that answer into millions of homes and across foreign borders. A stamp could celebrate a new railway, honor a national hero, mark an anniversary, or display a map that quietly reinforced a political claim. It was small enough to be overlooked, yet it traveled farther than most paintings, statues, or official speeches ever could. Millions of copies passed through homes, businesses, ports, and borders. Each one carried a carefully chosen image of the nation that issued it. In that sense, stamps became miniature ambassadors. They did not simply move letters, they moved ideas about history, power, culture, and belonging. For governments, each stamp became a public message printed in enormous numbers. A banknote showed what a nation valued economically. A postage stamp showed how that nation wanted to be remembered. And once governments understood that power, the stamp would no longer remain a neutral object. It could celebrate identity. But it could also shape it. A postage stamp could carry a love letter, but it could also carry the image of an empire. As stamps became symbols of national identity, governments began using them to project power. A new ruler could replace the face of the old one. An occupied territory could receive new stamps. Existing stamps were sometimes overprinted with new names, new values, or new symbols, allowing a change of power to appear almost instantly in the corner of an envelope. A map printed on a tiny piece of paper could quietly declare who controlled a border. During wars, stamps became even more political. Their images honored soldiers, celebrated victories, promoted unity, and carried a government's version of events into millions of homes and military camps. Letters themselves also became part of the machinery of war. Messages from soldiers were inspected. Envelopes were stamped by military authorities. Certain details were removed before a letter could reach home. For families, the arrival of a stamped envelope could mean relief, fear, or grief. The stamp remained small and silent, yet it could reveal who held power, which government claimed legitimacy, and what story a nation wanted its people to believe. It was no longer merely proof that postage had been paid. It had become a symbol of authority, and sometimes the corner of an envelope carried almost as much meaning as the words inside it. But for the people waiting at home, the politics printed on the envelope mattered less than one question: who had written the letter? For more than a century, the postage stamp appeared beside some of the most important words people ever wrote. It traveled with love letters, family news, job applications, wedding invitations, and messages from distant relatives. It crossed oceans with immigrants writing home. It left battlefields carrying messages from soldiers who wanted their families to know they were still alive. It arrived with university acceptances, business contracts, apologies, condolences, and announcements that changed entire lives. The stamp never wrote any of those messages. It never said, "I miss you." It never said, "I am safe." It never said, "Please come home." But it gave those words a way to cross the distance between one life and another. A letter was more than information. It had weight. It carried handwriting, folded paper, fading ink, and the marks of a physical journey. The postmark revealed where it had been and when it had begun traveling. People waited days, weeks, or even months for an envelope to arrive, and when it finally did, they often kept it. Some letters were stored in drawers for decades. Others were tied together with string, passed down through families, and opened long after the writer was gone. The stamp was usually the smallest object on the envelope, but it was the reason the entire message could move. By the height of the postal age, it had become more than proof of payment. It had become a quiet witness to human memory. Then, something unexpected happened. After stamps had carried messages across borders, wars, and generations, people began saving an object designed to be used only once. Collectors noticed that every stamp contained a story. Its image revealed what a nation valued. The postmark beside it showed where the letter had entered the postal system and when its journey began. Its paper, ink, perforations, and printing method could identify a particular moment in history. Some stamps became valuable because they were beautiful. Others became valuable because something had gone wrong. A color was printed incorrectly. A small batch was issued before being withdrawn. A government disappeared soon after placing its name on the design. The most famous example appeared in the United States in 1918. A 24-cent airmail stamp showed a blue Curtiss Jenny airplane surrounded by a red frame. But on one sheet, the airplane was accidentally printed upside down. Only one sheet of 100 inverted stamps was sold before the mistake was discovered. A tiny printing error had transformed ordinary postage into one of the most recognizable treasures in the history of stamp collecting. Sometimes, the stamp itself was not the rarest part. A common stamp attached to an envelope from a battlefield, a vanished colony, or a historic voyage could become far more important because of the journey it had completed. Stamp collecting grew into a global pursuit. People organized albums by country, date, subject, and printing error. They studied tiny details through magnifying glasses and searched for surviving examples of issues that had almost disappeared. They were not simply collecting pieces of paper. They were collecting evidence. Each stamp preserved a government, a border, a technology, or a moment that the world had already begun to forget. What began as proof of payment had become evidence that a vanished place, government, route, or moment had once existed. For more than a century, the postage stamp had defeated distance by making physical communication cheaper and more reliable. Then, a new technology made physical distance almost irrelevant. For centuries, every improvement in communication focused on moving letters faster. Messages traveled first by horse, then by ship, railway, truck, and airplane. But no matter how fast the journey became, every letter still required the same basic things: paper, an envelope, an address, a stamp, and someone to physically carry it. Then email arrived. For the first time, a message no longer had to travel through the physical world. A person could write a few lines, press send, and deliver them across the planet in seconds. There was no postage to buy, no envelope to seal, no post office to visit, and no reason to wait beside a mailbox. The new system was faster, cheaper, and more convenient than anything that had come before it. Personal letters declined, bills moved online, invitations became digital, messages that once took days to arrive could now appear instantly on a screen. The postage stamp began to disappear from everyday life. But something else disappeared with it. Digital messages had no handwriting, no fading ink, no postmark, and no physical evidence of the distance they had crossed. They could be copied, deleted, or forgotten almost as quickly as they were sent. Email did not destroy communication. It made communication easier than ever. But in removing the weight, and the journey, it also changed what a message felt like. For the first time, humanity no longer needed the postage stamp, and only then did people begin to understand what it had carried besides the mail. The postage stamp did not disappear. It simply changed its purpose. People may no longer need stamps for every message, but they still choose them for the messages that matter enough to become physical. They appear on wedding invitations, thank you letters, holiday cards, official documents, and postcards sent from distant places. Artists use stamps as part of mail art. Collectors preserve new issues alongside stamps that are more than a century old. Travelers choose designs that represent the country they are visiting. Some people still search carefully for the perfect stamp before sending a personal letter. In a digital world, that choice carries meaning. An email can be written and sent in seconds. A physical letter requires paper, an address, a stamp, and a deliberate trip through the postal system. It takes effort, and that effort becomes part of the message. The stamp is no longer essential to every conversation, but when it appears, it reminds the recipient that someone chose a slower, more personal way to reach them. The stamp was no longer present in every conversation. Instead, it appeared in selected ones. Messages people wanted to make physical, ceremonial, collectible, or difficult to forget. Its everyday dominance had ended. Its symbolic life had begun. A postage stamp matters for reasons far greater than its size. First, it creates trust. Before it became art, history, or a collector's item, a stamp was proof that a promise had been made. The sender had paid. The postal system had accepted responsibility. The letter had entered a network built to carry it to someone far away. Second, a stamp gives a nation a face. On a space smaller than a coin, a country can display its leaders, landscapes, inventions, wildlife, victories, and memories. A nation may be too large to hold in your hand, but the story it wants to tell about itself can fit on a stamp. Most importantly, a stamp turns a message into a physical journey. A digital message appears instantly on a screen. A letter must move through real space. It can be folded, carried, stamped, delayed, damaged, and finally placed into another person's hands. The postmark records where the journey began. The envelope carries the marks of distance. And the stamp proves that someone chose to send more than words. That is why the postage stamp survived, even after it stopped being necessary for everyday communication. It is not important because it is paper with adhesive on the back. It is important because it transforms distance into something that can be crossed. Right now, somewhere in the world, a collector is examining a century-old stamp beneath a magnifying glass. A traveler is pressing a new stamp onto a postcard before sending it home. A family is opening a box of letters written by someone who is no longer alive. And inside a sorting center glowing through the night, a stamped envelope is beginning another physical journey, from one pair of hands to another. The age when every message required a stamp may be ending, but the journeys have not stopped. In the early 19th century, a letter could reach someone's door and still remain beyond their reach. The postage stamp changed that. It turned payment into proof, distance into a system, and private words into something ordinary people could send. A postage stamp is more than evidence that a fee was paid. It is evidence that someone, somewhere, believed another person was worth crossing the distance for.